Exodus 20, verse 15. You shall not steal. No one is born a thief. It's a choice to violate both the covenant relationship with God and the community one belongs to. Parents of young children should be very familiar with the fact that everyone born into this world eventually begins at a certain point to claim mine. We have an innate sense of ownership from an early age. The eighth commandment teaches that we must respect and cherish the things that belong to our neighbors, just as much as we cherish ours. As with the command to not murder and the command to not commit adultery, this one goes deep as well. Let's dive in and see what we can find in this commandment. The Israelites stood trembling beneath the quaking mountain. Smoke billowed from it. Lightning flashed, and I'm sure the thunder shook them in their bones. The sound of the trumpet blared, and the voice of God rang out over and over, listing offenses that he would not tolerate. They had heard the first 4 commands related to their relationship with him. They were not to have any other gods before him. They were not to worship idols, disrespect his name, and they were not to forsake his Sabbath rest. After that, God turned his attention to how they were to respect one another. They were to honor the parents that were to instruct them in his ways. They could not take their neighbor's life. They could not break their marriage vows and dishonor their spouses. And now his voice cracked forth again.
Not enough.
They could not violate their neighbor's possessions. Anyone who had already been guilty of any of these things was fearful in what they saw on the mountain, fearful of the repercussions of what might follow if they disobeyed these commands. This sight was so terrifying that Moses records in Exodus 20 verses 18 and 19 that when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled in fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die." I can only imagine how terrible it would have been knowing that you violated his commands, or fearing that you might have, and what would result if you did. The 8th commandment states you shall not steal, to prevent the invasion of the neighbor's property rights, but stealing includes both visible and invisible elements such as the neighbor's life, and also their welfare. As stated earlier, no one is born a thief, yet what we see in reality bears an examination. There are thieves in every generation, and there are more thieves in prison than any other criminal. In the U.S., larceny, or theft of personal property, outpaces violent crime 6-1. And globally, things aren't much better, being at an estimated 3 or 4-1. And these are only convicted cases. Theft, though not a natural state for us, is a decision that people keep making generation after generation. Theft is persistent, pervasive, and personal. Our prisons prove that it's common, and God knows that it exists everywhere, so he accounts for it in his law, and will hold those accountable for their choice to violate their neighbor's possessions. The Hebrew word for steal is ganab, meaning to carry away, to take away by stealth, and to deceive. There are 2 types of stealing we need to discuss: forceful theft of someone's property, as well as deception. Now, stealing is defined as the action or offense of taking another person's property without permission or legal right, and without intending to return it. It's an act of seeking one's own profit at the expense of invading the rights of others. In the context of forceful theft, the commandment refers to money, male or female servants, garments, flocks, crops, or ornaments. These are all listed in Exodus 22 verses 1 through 15. Not repaying borrowed money is also theft. But a stealth act of deceiving others is also stealing. Stealing is also cunningly entrapping someone to derive benefit or acting secretly and deceptively. Think Jacob's uncle Laban, who tricked Jacob into working for him longer and who cheated him by changing his wages. We have to understand that any deceptive act, even if there is no monetary loss, can be defined as stealing. Yet even there, we're not finished. Stealing applies to both tangible and intangible things. Not working diligently or idly doing something else in the given time is theft. If you're being paid to work, but you're not performing that work, You're stealing time from your employer. We have to make the most of our time, and not just for our worldly employers, but also for God too. His response to theft shows us how much he loathes it. When you steal, God doesn't just demand punishment, but payback. Stealing is not just a don't do that commandment. When you steal, God demands that you give back plus more. Leviticus 24:18. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. The term used here for make good is shalom, meaning to complete, to be sound, to make amends, and to repay. It refers to the debtor repaying his debts and completely restoring the property. If you're familiar at all with Hebrew words, that one might sound familiar to you. Shalom is closely related to the Hebrew word for peace, shalom. The word shalom is deeply rooted in the idea of wholeness and harmony in relationship. The restitution that God demands is the process through which that relationship is restored. And to do so, he demands more than simply giving back what you took. Let's read Exodus chapter 21, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox, and 4 sheep for the sheep. If you were to steal an ox to slaughter or sell, you repay 5 oxen. Steal a sheep, repay 4 sheep. That's a pretty steep punishment, 4 or 5 times the value of what you stole. And that's because it's not just loss, it's livelihood. An oxen can plow, and sheep provide wool and meat, and they breed. If the stolen animal is still alive, the recompense is lower, and only double what was stolen. But the thief always repays more than they initially took. Let's also read Leviticus 6:2-5. When a person sins and acts unfaithfully against the Lord, and deceives his companion in regard to a deposit, or security entrusted to him, or through robbery, or if he is extorted from his companion, or he has found what was lost and lied about it, and swore falsely, so that he sins in regard to any one of these things a man may do, then it shall be, when he sins and becomes guilty, that he shall restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by extortion, or the deposit which was entrusted to him, or the lost thing which he found, or anything about which he swore falsely. He shall make restitution for it in full, and add to it 1/5 more. He shall give it to the one to whom it belongs on the day he presents his guilt offering. In the case of deceptive theft, the thief is to repay the whole plus 1/5 or 20% more. The restitution serving to restore the shalom, or peace between the two parties. The law here is applying justice. The victim gets the whole, and the thief feels the cost of their actions. But remember, theft does not only apply to tangible things. It also applies to the invisible rights of our neighbors, the rights to freedom, happiness, and life. Deuteronomy 23 and 24 spend quite a large amount of time discussing restitution and specific laws surrounding theft, and I'll try to do my best to list them quickly here. You can't profit from your neighbor's need by charging them interest. You must respect your neighbor's livelihood. God was going to bless Israel so much that he gave special provisions that if any poor did exist, that they had the right to glean from the edges of their neighbor's fields. But he did ensure that they did not have the right to reap a field that they didn't sow. That would be considered theft. You could not take life as collateral. You were banned from accepting a hand mill, the tool they used to grind flour, as collateral against a loan, because you would be accepting that which your neighbor needed to sustain themselves. And finally, if you kidnapped an Israelite, the punish was death. Kidnapping isn't just taking a body, you're stealing liberty, joy, and that individual's right to exist. These are not items that you can pilfer because they are intangible, but God's laws guard them just as fiercely. But we're not finished. Let's read Jeremiah 23, verse 30. Therefore, behold, I am against the prophets, declares the Lord, who steal my words from each other. Here, the word steal is in the pial form of the verb ganab. This verse reflects the days of Jeremiah, when many prophets deceived people by uttering their own words as if they were from God, or by taking the word that true prophets had received from God and uttering them as if they had received it directly from him themselves. He goes on by saying, I am against these smooth-tongued prophets who say this prophecy is from the Lord. As we discussed in the third commandment, we cannot attribute words to God that he did not say. This is a violation of taking his name in vain. God will not overlook those who steal his words. Absalom, David's son, didn't steal words, but he stole hearts. Here in 2 Samuel, stole away is in the intensive form of the Hebrew verb ganab, implying that Absalom deceived the people and stole their hearts. Absalom sweet-talked the men of the nation to usurp his father. This wasn't a forcible theft, but a con. He was taking loyalty that belonged elsewhere through deception, and that is not lawful under the 8th commandment. Beyond neighbors, though, we must also take care that we do not steal from God, either his time or his offerings and tithes. All time is given to us from God. Hence, wasting time is the sin of stealing it. We discussed our job as Christians today in our video series on the garments of the priests. If we fail to make the most of our time and perform the duties of our positions, we have stolen that time from God. Let's read Ephesians 5:16. Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. Jesus said that a person found working when the master comes home would be blessed. That person is a faithful and sensible servant. We have to be certain that the things we choose to spend our time on are done so wisely, and we cannot steal from God in our tithes and offerings either. Let's read Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. Keep in mind that I don't have a Patreon account. This channel is not monetized, and I have no way of obtaining funds from you. This is a touchy subject for many when it's brought up from the pulpit because the perception is that the pastor or speaker is trying to get more money from you. The reality, however, is that the lack of offering and obedience to the tithe that Malachi is exposing here is that the human mind is filled with a thief's mentality, under the false notion that everything belongs to oneself when everything truly belongs to the Creator God. People become stingy and unwilling to express their thanksgiving to God with their wealth. That is equivalent to stealing, which God detests. Tithing to God 1/10 of our possession is how we confess that everything we own, including the remaining 9/10, all belongs to God. We can't lay our hands on what belongs to him. Adam broke the commandment not to steal in the garden. Adam was placed in the garden and given specific instructions. He was to cultivate and keep the garden. He didn't own it himself. He was the caretaker. Yet he and his wife treated God's possessions as if they owned them by taking something that didn't belong to them even after being instructed not to. And in Jesus' time, the religious leaders stole the hearts and the minds of the people who had previously welcomed Jesus with shouts of Hosanna, Son of David. The religious leaders convinced the crowds instead to shout, Free Barabbas, and crucify Jesus. Colossians 1:16 states, For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. Though the hearts and the minds of the crowds were created for Christ, the religious leaders stole the hearts of the people away from him. I pray today that all of us might come to respect our neighbor's tangible and intangible possessions, that we may respect their life and their dignity. And furthermore, I pray that we can refrain from stealing time, tithes, offerings, or even hearts from God. Thank you for watching, everyone, and God bless.
לא תגנוב.